Hey everyone, my name is Tony Burke. I'm an FAA senior rigger, AFF instructor, canopy coach, SNTA, and today we're going to talk about a subject I get asked a lot and I see a lot of people asking questions about, and that's how old is too old for a reserve canopy? So a couple of disclaimers because we are talking about skydiving. Number one, skydiving is a dangerous sport and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. It has been said that skydiving is a dangerous sport that can be done safely, which is something I agree with, but your safety is largely in your own hands. Jump at your own risk. This guide is not meant to replace the wisdom of your local riggers and instructors. They know you better than I do. If there's anything that I say in this guide that contradicts anything that your local riggers say, I would probably go with them. And while I strive for accuracy, I'm a human and capable of making mistakes, so if you think something in this is inaccurate, please let me know in the comments. A couple things about reserves too. Reserves should always be inspected before being packed. Just because a reserve can be okay at a certain age and usage does not mean it is. It needs to be inspected, and the only way to answer that question is to have a rigger inspect it before they pack it. And in the United States, that's a requirement, and I think most other places it is too, and even if it isn't, it's a good idea. Skydiving is only for properly trained individuals. Reserve canopies are more docile than main canopies, but that doesn't mean you can't get hurt or even worse if they're used improperly. So make sure you get the proper training. Make sure you're jumping at the right wing loading. In this discussion, we're going to be talking about reserves and the laws that pertain to them in the United States. Regulations for other countries will differ, so check with your local regulations or aviation authority. So we're going to be USA specific here, but again, there's so many different countries where skydiving is, I can't possibly cover all those scenarios. Also, I'm not a lawyer, let alone an aviation lawyer, so this presentation is based on the best information that I have available. Also, I wanted to do a disambiguation. So when the FAA considers three different types of rigs, parachute holding containers, depending on their usage. There's a tandem skydiving, which is referred to as a dual harness, dual parachute system. There's the bailout rig, which is a single harness, single parachute, so that's only for an emergency. Sometimes you see jump pilots wearing them. Aerobatic pilots typically wear them as well. And then we have sports skydiving, so that's a single harness, dual parachute system. That's what we all jump when we're doing our fun skydive. So we're just going to be talking about sports skydiving gear. For example, one of the things that we talk about with age restrictions on reserves in sports skydiving in the United States, there are no age restrictions. But in tandem gear and bailout gear, there often are age time limit restrictions. So the rules for those are a little bit different, and depending on the manufacturer. So make sure you check with the manufacturer if you're researching reserves for tandems or for bailout rigs. This is not a discussion of those. So how old is too old? So let's talk about the factors in canopy age. Generally speaking, we're talking about time, calendar years. We're talking about usage. We're talking about design. Some designs are more modern than other designs. And we're also talking about how the canopies are stored. In the US, there are no blanket time limits on any skydiving gear. So it can't be more than 20 years old or more than 25 years old. There's none of that in the United States. In other countries, there are. So in some countries, they limit all skydiving gear or reserves and containers or whatever to like 20 years or 25 years. It kind of depends on the country. But in the United States, there is no blanket time limit. The FAA does specify to follow manufacturer instructions. But as far as I know, and all the reserves that I've researched for this, no sports skydiving gear approved in the US has a time limit specified by the manufacturer that I'm aware of. Now, some tandem reserves do, and bailout rigs or bailout reserves both typically have time limits, but for the sports skydiving market, we tend not to have any time limits. But like I said, other countries will have regulatory time limits. Now, nylon is an interesting fabric because it actually ages really well. So time itself does not seem to impact nylon all that much. If it's properly cared for, nylon can be serviceable and can be airworthy for decades. So time by itself doesn't seem to affect nylon. Now, packing does. It might be if it's stored improperly, like in a humid environment, that might affect it. But just the passage of time does not seem to degrade nylon, or at least not in the span of decades. Usage. So usage of these reserves, both packing and deployments, will age them, and some of them have some limits on that. So every time a reserve is packed or deployed, the fabric permeability will increase over time. This is F111 material, which is a non-zero porosity material, so it does let a little bit of air through. And through packing and deployments, it'll start to let more and more air through. That's going to affect your flight characteristics, your flares, and your openings, and that's pretty normal for F111 material or F111 based canopies. Most of the sport main canopies that we jump are made out of ZP, zero porosity material. It's the same nylon, but instead of being treated the F111 way, which is a process called calendaring, it's coated in typically some sort of silicone-based coating that's what makes it slippery and crispy, and at zero porosity, it doesn't let any air through. But reserve material typically is F111 style material, and it will wear over time. And generally, F111 material wears quicker than ZP. With that in mind, many reserves have a specific limit on the usage before requiring an inspection on permeability. So for example, for performance designs in Icarus, it's 40 pack jobs or 25 deployments. For Aerodyne, it's 40 pack jobs or 10 deployments before they need to be tested for permeability. Most riggers do not have a good way to test permeability, so that's basically effectively means that we need to send it back to the factory and they'll recertify it for another number of pack jobs depending on what the test results show. So this is the Icarus Reserve Warning Panel, and PD also has the same warning panel. There's little squares you see there in the middle of that warning panel, and that's the data log. Performance designs in Icarus both have log sections in the warning labels that allows for precise tracking of deployments and packing. Both of those things will affect its lifespan. And I really wish every reserve manufacturer had this. I really like this about both Icarus and Performance Designs, is that they have this. Other reserves, it's up to the rigger to determine the airworthiness of the reserve. The data card on the container should contain all the pack jobs and deployments on that reserve, so you can track how many, you should be able to track how many times that reserve has been packed. But it's not uncommon for this information to be incomplete. A lot of the older reserves that are like 10, 15, 20 years old or even longer, they may not have a complete packing history in their data log. So that's something to keep in mind, which is another reason why I really appreciate the fact that both Icarus and Performance Designs has that log on the warning panel itself, because you're not going to lose that data card. It's on the actual parachute itself. Another thing that can affect if a reserve is too old is the design of the reserve, depending on how old that design is. We're getting to some reserves that are quite old. The fabric may be okay, but the design is not. Older reserves, like those designed in like the 1980s, for example, were not designed for more than 1.0 wing loading. For example, I got this little clip from from Precision Aerodynamics, the Raven Reserve Manual from 1988, and it says above 1.0 is actually prohibited. In that time period, we weren't jumping. Well, not me, I wasn't jumping back then, but in that time period, people weren't jumping canopies wing loaded over 1.0. A 150 was considered a pocket rocket and dangerous. Nowadays, it's not uncommon for a licensed jumper to start out at about 1.0, depending on a number of factors, and start to increase the wing loading above 1.0 not long after they get licensed, like a couple hundred jumps. So these reserves that are pretty old, like I said, designed in the 80s, are just not going to be appropriate for that because they're not designed for that wing loading. Now, that doesn't mean it's a good idea to heavily load a modern reserve designs. Something that's considered a more modern reserve doesn't mean you should load it at 1.8 or 2.0 or something like that. There's other concerns with that, specifically related to just physics and how fast they'll go, how fast they'll turn, your descent rate, etc. But some of these older reserves, like the Micro Raven, just weren't designed for this type of flying. The Micro Ravens in particular have a stall problem. So if you come in for landing, you go to flare, and typically flare about here. If they're loaded at like 1.2 even, they'll collapse behind you. So there's many tales of skydivers that have had a cutaway. The reserve opened up just fine. They're flying their pattern or flying to their landing area. They come in, they flare, they get to about here, and the canopy collapses and they fall on their back. so you get hurt that way. So that's something specifically that happens with the micro Ravens. So they weren't meant to be jumped at more than 1.0 wing loading. Other older designs that are just too old, for example, I see this come up sometimes, not too frequently, but every now and then, the original 5-cell Swift reserve. Now there's a Swift Plus, which is a 7-cell reserve, which can be fine. It's an older design, but it's still okay in some circumstances. But the original 5-cell, I would say, is not appropriate for any new skydiver, or most skydivers. I do actually know a few people that have them in their rigs, but they know what they are. They fly very differently. The toggles are all different. So not something I would recommend for anyone to jump. And then anything round. Don't see this too much anymore, but we're not trained, especially new skydivers, we're not trained on rounds. It would be generally not a good idea to jump around as a reserve. And a lot of places just won't even allow it. Storage. So storing a canopy, depending on how you store it, can mean whether or not a canopy is going to be airworthy or not when it's taken out of storage. So what typically will age a regular canopy is things like UV sunlight, dust, sand, sweat when packing, and proper storage environment and schmutz of various types. Desert environments like Skydive Arizona, in Eloy, Arizona, or Skydive Paris, or even Skydive Elsinore. These are desert environments, and the sand and the dust can get into the gear, and it'll wear the ZP material, etc. So you'll run into some issues there. But reserves generally aren't exposed to these type of environments. They're in the free bag inside the container, so they're safe from a lot of these environmental hazards to canopies. What generally will age or damage a reserve is improper storage. So they'll get mold or mildew on them, and that will start to eat the fabric from the inside. So this is one of the reasons why we inspect reserves to make sure that this doesn't happen, especially if it's come out of storage. Probably one of the things that will condemn reserves in a lot of cases, probably one of the most common ways that reserves are condemned is we see mildew on them. Once there's mildew on a reserve, it's pretty much condemned. It's not going to be airworthy again. Because there's mildew we see, and there may be mildew we don't see. This generally doesn't happen if it's stored in like your closet, as long as you live in a temperature-controlled, climate-controlled house or apartment. Typically happens if it's stored in like a storage shed out back where it's exposed to the humidity of the environment, especially in areas where there's a lot of humidity. Or if it's in like a storage unit somewhere, again, not climate controlled, so the humidity can go way up. That allows mold and mildew to grow and start to eat the fabric, and pretty much the canopy is done after that. Some riggers won't pack anything over a certain age. I do know some riggers that say, 20 years or 25 years, nothing over that. That is their right. They are not required to pack anything. So it's well within their professional rights to. Not only is it well within their legal rights not to pack something that they don't like, they could say, you know what, I don't want to pack anything that's a blue reserve for whatever reason. So that's up to them. It's well within their professionalism to refuse to pack gear over a certain age if that's what they choose. So if your gear is so old, riggers are refusing to pack for it, maybe it's time for newer gear, even if the fabric might be okay. So just something to keep in mind. So to answer the question, how old is too old for a reserve? Well, as we talked about, there's a lot of factors involved, so we can't really give you a hard and concrete answer. The passage of time does not tend to degrade nylon. If nylon is cared for correctly, it can last for decades. Packing and usage does wear the fabric and does make the canopy age. Some canopies like Performance Designs reserves have a data log on the warning panel on the canopy itself, which can help us track the usage and packing. And canopies do need to be stored correctly in order for them to last a long time. If you do have any questions about whether a particular reserve you're looking at is too old, you can always ask a local rigger. If you have any questions for me, you can leave them down in the comments below. And thank everyone for watching.